want to share that this webinar is sponsored by the V3 movement. We are a church planting movement, equipping church planters all across the country and some overseas around grounded missional practices. We start in mid-August and go through mid-December and then continue from mid-January through mid-May. And it's really all about equipping church planters for grassrooted missional practice. And so we're really excited to explore some of these concepts even today as we talk about this, the place that we are right now. And so we're really blessed to have with us Josh Hayden, Christy Foldenauer, and Q Lee, who are all here to lead us and guide us. When we think about pruning, and I'm Lori Ruffin, I'm also the operations manager with the V3 movement. When we think about pruning branches on a living plant helps it to be more productive. It helps it to grow more fruit and sustain the plant for the long haul. And as churches have become dispersed because of COVID-19, it has revealed that the fruit of our labor, when revealed the fruit of our labor when times in the past have felt much less complicated. The lessons that we're learning right now about how to be the church in today's time can help us get rid of overgrown programs, unproductive gatherings, and aimless neighboring. And so now that we're in this moment, we're really left with a question of what does it mean to be the church, how to incorporate the mission of God into everyday lives. And we're excited to think that, as we move forward, what could the resulting fruit look like? And so these lessons are going to be exploring what does it mean to shepherd, what does it mean to pioneer, to teach, to call into relationship, and even to share the good news in a post-coronavirus church. So we're going to explore today some of these themes. Preparing to be the church on mission on the other side of the pandemic, how this great pruning that is occurring in our churches can be for our good and for the good of our neighbors, how to invite your leadership to plan beyond this challenging season, and then how remissioning your church during this time can lead to greater faithfulness in the mission of God. So joining us today to guide us through this conversation, we have Josh Hayden. He's the senior pastor of First Baptist Church in Ashland, Virginia. He studied organizational change and the idea of creative destruction and how creative destruction and how that moves us forward. He also has received his Doctor of Ministry at the Duke Divinity School. And then we also have Q Lee, who was born in Seoul, South Korea, and raised in Nairobi, Kenya. He was educated in evangelical and reform institutions in the U.S. And has lived and church planted and ministered cross-culturally in Philadelphia since 1993. He is a leading voice within Missio Alliance and as well as a coach, a church planting coach for the V3 movement. We also are really blessed to have with us Christy Foldenauer, who's a senior pastor at Tomahawk Baptist Church. She is a leader, a communicator with over 17 years of ministry experience, really gifted in using creativity, word pictures, and metaphors in meaningful ways to help people connect with Scripture. And so we're really glad that she's here as she has been leading and cultivating small group communities across church cultures, a variety of types of church cultures, with her passion for discipleship. And I again am the host here and facilitator, Lori Ruffin, operations manager with the V3 movement. And so with all of that said, we are going to hear from our guests. And as they are sharing this great content with us, you may have a question that arises. We want to encourage you to drop that into the Q&A section. And we'd love to hear, and we'll get to some of those questions at the end of our time. All right, with that, I hand it over to you.
So for too long, churches have been trying to survive instead of thrive. So long before the coronavirus arrived here in the West and long before the pandemic was on the horizon for most of us, for years, there's been this growing sense in established churches that we've just been trying to survive. survive the changing landscape, the changing technology, generational gaps, expectations for what church should be. And somewhere along the line, we believed that it was simply okay to just be alive as a church. Didn't have to bear fruit. There was no expectation that disciples would be making new disciples. And Jesus describes the situation like this in a parable in Luke chapter 13, starting in verse 6. And there's going to be the scripture passage on the screen. So Jesus tells this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it, and he found none. And he came and said to the gardener, "See here, for 3 years I've come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting soil?" He replied, "Sir, let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure on it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, you can cut it down." Jesus makes a pretty startling claim in this parable that just as we shouldn't think about our sinfulness bringing tragedy, neither should we think that as individuals or churches, that simply existing means that we are doing what we were designed to do. Just because a church hasn't been cut down doesn't mean that it's living the good life or bearing fruit. Let me be really clear. Existence is not the same as bearing fruit. Churches are like trees, and God is like the great gardener, doing everything possible to get the soil of our churches ready to bear fruit. God never leaves us to our own resources, but fertilizes our landscape with love to bring about fruit and repentance. God is not out to get us. Repentance is meant to be a gift. It's a spiritual pruning from God, and it's one of the habits that God gives us to make fruitfulness possible. But the crucial thing about pruning is this. Pruning branches on a living plant helps it to be more productive, grow better fruit, and sustain the plant for the long haul. There's been a really consistent theme from leaders in the Great Pruning, and it's this: apocalypse. So on the screen here, you'll see this definition of an apocalypse. An apocalypse is an unveiling. It's a revealing of what has always been true, but was previously hidden. How is your church shepherding one another? How are the vulnerable in your community being seen and loved? How is your church on mission with your community? Are folks simply consuming content, or are they actually experiencing transformation? This apocalypse, this moment, unveils who we are. It tells us about the anxieties that are lying underneath the surface. It tells us about whether or not we've been bent on survival or fruitfulness. This apocalypse unveils who we are. I'm going to paraphrase Dallas Willard here, but this is the reality that we have to come to grips with. Your church is perfectly designed to get the results it's currently getting. Pruning, however, gives us a tool to change the way we exist, to change the way we grow, to change the fruit that we bear. I have a couple of knockout rose bushes in my yard, and they look like this on the screen. And we learned in the last year that there's some really important things to consider when you prune a rose bush. It's important to think about what time it is, like what season is best for the plant to grow or be pruned. What's the end goal with this rose bush? How large do you want the plant to grow? Do you want to take off a piece of it and plant another rose bush from the mother plant? Is this a minor or a major pruning? Minor pruning happens every year, but major pruning every couple of years. And also, is this a growing season or a pruning season? One of the worst things you can do for a plant is to actually let it to grow and start to create some buds and then prune it. It's wasted all this energy creating buds that will never grow fruit. So just like pruning is essential for a rose bush to thrive, pruning is also an essential part of leading your church and being a follower of Jesus. So Q, could you talk a little bit about what pruning for new life looks like for leaders?
Yeah, let's look at the slides, and we're going to stay on that for a little bit. But post-Christendom has been a time when we've been going in this direction for a while now, but this pandemic, I believe, has truly forced this issue upon us. Now is the time for us to say, as leaders especially, the church of our dreams is dead. Long live the Church of Christ. I think just from an economic point of view, many of the visions and the dreams that we had simply will not be feasible anymore, and we're going to need to let them go. The church of our dreams is getting blown away, and we could grieve that, but that could be a good thing if it means pruning away the triumphalist church, the self-sufficient church, the consumerist church. So leadership during this time will mean stewarding the church through this time of great transition from the pre-virus epoch to the post-virus epoch, and just realizing that there will be no going back to normal. And for more on this, I want to recommend reading Andy Crouch and others' article, Leading Beyond the Blizzard, Why Every Organization is Now a Startup. It's going to be listed in further resources section at the end. They say this is the time to throw out the old playbook. This is a time for the church and your organization to reinvent. But to do that, the leader is the one that first must model this whole lamentation process. You personally will need to take the time to give the old reality a proper burial and go through the stages of grief on behalf of others. And doing this well is going to help all of your people go through the grieving process and come out on the other side to face the new reality with a gospel hope. If you haven't gone through the grieving process, you will still be holding on to the old, and you will miss the new possibilities because all you will be seeing are threats and ghosts. And so here I want to share 3 aspects of your personal rule and rhythm of life that I would commend to you that you develop during this crisis. And first is developing your theology of weakness. You are disciples going to Jerusalem with Jesus, and you are going to the cross with Jesus, not to lobby him for the seats at his right and left. And here are some questions to help you with that. What theology of triumphalism does this pandemic reveal? You know, that whole apocalypse. And some of that is going to reveal self-dependency. Sometimes it's going to reveal over-reliance on money, technical know-how, personal charisma, good programming, and so on, which are going to be meaningless in the face of pandemic. Others are privilege and power and savior complex and paternalism. So what I mean by this is in times like this, in times of crisis, it's easy for pastors to rush around putting out all of the fires, and you can easily take on a savior role. You can slip into a self-dependency mode. And it's especially true if you're part of the dominant culture group. You're used to having other people need you. You are used to privilege and power solving problems. But that doesn't jive in the face of a pandemic. We come face to face with our weakness, but that's really the gospel truth, though, isn't it? Not the triumphalism of self-sufficiency. So I think we need to build regularly in what dreams and visions of the church do you need to let go of? Ask this on a regular basis. And what limitations and weaknesses and needs are you confessing? How are you relearning to settle into God's grace? Because we are helpless. And then how are you building these into the rhythms of life? Second, develop self-care. This is a function that arises from your theology of weakness and embracing of your limits. If you have a functional theology of triumphalism, during crisis, you will jettison your own wellness. But Paul said to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20-28, keep watch over yourselves and then the flock. Keep watch over yourselves. This is the time to be especially intentional about scheduling self-care and sticking to it. You need to pace yourself during this time because we're going to need you for the long haul. For too long, we've gone after short-term gains at the expense of the long game. And this is going to be an ultra marathon, not a sprint. So being mindful about solitude, meditation, fasting from your devices because we are addicted to them, and knowing how to step away so that we can detox. Are you exercising? And many pastors, they just are not thinking about their health. Are you eating in a healthy way? I took up running about 10 years ago, and I've run about 10 marathons. And since then, running has been a refuge for me through some trying times in my life. When people ask why I run, I say it's cheaper than therapy. It's helped me to pray better and gain a better perspective on hardship and endurance, not to mention it's given me a better physical health. Are you sleeping enough? Are you practicing the Sabbath? Are you being faithful? A friend runs a rescue mission in my city. Once the mission almost burned to the ground because of arson committed by one of the men in the program. And it was a very challenging time for my friend. And I asked him how he was getting through. I never forget what he told me. I put in my hours, 9 to 5, and work the best that I can. And then I simply close the door, walk away, and enjoy time with family. Then I do the same thing the next day. And there's a lot for all of us to learn from him for our time. Third, decentralize leadership. Develop others' gifts. Make this the time to pivot from a hierarchical leadership model to a polycentric leadership model. Social distancing is not going to go away anytime soon. As a matter of fact, people are saying it's going to come back in waves. And you're going to need to have a minister, a place in every home during this pandemic because you can't be there yourself. One of Eugene Peterson's books is entitled The Unnecessary Pastor, and that's all of us now. You know, this is a time to delegate leadership responsibility to others and develop them. This is a time to depend on them and grow them, their gifts, and grow them and help them to flourish into their roles. Christy is going to have more to say on this next, but an important part of decentralizing has to do with you as a leader re-envisioning your leadership structure so that it becomes a community of mutually submitted, mutually dependent leaders who bring different gifts to the table for the good of the whole, and also known as polycentric leadership. Structures that's been shaped by consumerism are getting pruned away so that the Spirit can create a living communities with us. I want to highlight the fact that there's a very personal aspect to this. Decentralizing leadership means you need to see your own role differently. You are less of a preacher in the CEO mold than a discipler, equiper, facilitator, one among many in your community. In other words, there needs to be a letting go of that centrality of your role, you know, that need to be needed, that clericalism. You could be, you could be the one that is the obstacle to the remissioning. So often this process involves personal lamenting and grieving. But remember, it's pruning so that there is new life. Christy, you got it next.
Thank you, Q. So I want to pick up on something that Q talked about as we begin to lean into what does pruning look like within the life of the church, and that is polycentric leadership. I really cannot stress this enough. As you think about pruning, one of the things that's a temptation for us, I know as a lead pastor, is to want to pick up the shears and just get to work. Maybe you're thinking, oh my gosh, I see all these things that I can trim away. I'm going to tell you to pause. And I'm going to tell you to be sure to not go this alone. This is not Lone Ranger work. And so what you need to think about are others who need to be at the table with you, because those balanced voices are going to help us to prune in the very best way that we can. And the danger of pruning without the balanced voices is that you'll bring the lens that you bring to ministry to your church, and you will prune the church to look like you. And that's not our goal here. That is not our goal. So I want to point you toward Ephesians 4, where we see a passage that talks about how Jesus has given to the church this different archetype of leadership that he's given to some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, some pastors, and some teachers. And many of you recognize right away that what I'm leaning into now is APEST, or the fivefold model of how we can lead our churches with all the voices at the table that help us to prosper. So I want to talk for a minute about those 5 voices in case this is new to you. And there will be resources at the end that'll help you to know more. But first of all, I want you to think about bringing apostles to the table right now. You're going to know these people because they are your dream awakeners. They're the people who innovate. They may very well be entrepreneurs. They're certainly entrepreneurial in spirit. They're visioners and they're adventurers. They're the people who are going to push you to new places. And then I want you to think about bringing to the table prophets. Your prophets are your heart revealers. They're the ones who ask the great questions at the table, and maybe it always feels like they're analyzing what's happening. Well, they are analyzing it, and that's great because you need those voices at the table. Your prophets are reformers, and they're about making meaning in the work of the church and making sure that the church is staying true to who we're called to be. Then you want to be sure at the table you have an evangelist. Evangelists are our storytellers. They're our recruiters. You already know who your evangelists are. They're the ones who can rally the troops and bring people out when you need people to participate in something, because evangelists know how to awaken in people the desire to be present and to be a part. They are passionate communicators. I want you to think about shepherds at the table. Many of us on this call will identify with this shepherd archetype. We are soul healers, caregivers, those who work as the social glue in our church structures, selfless servants, defenders of the church, and peacemakers within the church. In fact, if you like this phrase, community in unity, you're probably a shepherd. And then teachers. Teachers are those who are light givers. They're the philosophers in your church, the translators of what scripture looks like in this time. They're the ones who are awakening in us wisdom and truth. And you're going to know your teachers probably by what they're choosing to read. These are your readers. And so I want you to think about bringing all 5 of these voices to the table. Now in scripture, Jesus shows us all of these voices in one person. But listen, none of us is Jesus. None of us claims to be, thank goodness. I hope we can all agree on that. So each of us brings one primary voice, and we have a secondary voice as well. And you can identify those voices in yourself probably just by listening to what I just said. You can read on it more, but you also can take a free quiz online on a site called Fivefold Ministry, and it is a simple and a quick thing that you can do, and it'll help you to identify your voice. I want to encourage you to push that out to your people. My deacons have taken it, my staff team has taken it, my small group has even taken it, because as you find out where people are, first of all, it helps them to understand how they're gifted and wired to serve. What is their code in serving? How are they wired to show up? And then secondly, it helps you to balance the team at the table as you look at what decisions do we need to make as we move forward as the church. So I want to lastly say about APES that 80% of our pastors today, 80% research would say, are shepherds or teachers. This is a beautiful thing in the life of the church. And I also want to encourage you to think about who can you bring along on this journey that are apostles, prophets, and evangelists. As my friend John Chandler, who I saw earlier in the comments, would say, you got to release the apes. I agree with John. We've got to release the apes right now. The apostles, prophets, and evangelists are the ones who are going to help us know how do we lean forward to be the church that we are called to be on the other side of this pandemic. They're going to help you think about creative ways forward, and they're going to push you to think in new ways about how to be the church. As we think about being the church, I want to talk for a minute about how we evaluate what we're going to prune. And just in the same way that you would not on a Sunday stand up and preach a passage or even present a passage to a group of people from scripture that you had not taken the time to exegete, I want to encourage you to take the time to exegete your church. What do I mean by that? I want you to think about the context you're serving in. I want you to think about the ministries you're offering and the different ways that you are showing up in the community. So right now, my staff team, every week, we're asking the same set of questions. And here's what they look like. And I would encourage you to start having these kinds of conversations with some rigor right now. The first is, what's working right now? And the second is, what are we missing? What are the things that people are looking for that we are not doing, that we need to be thinking about doing? The third is, what do we need to change? Just because we've always done it does not mean it makes sense now. In fact, a lot of what we've always done does not make sense now. So what do we need to let go of? Those are the questions that we really need to be asking as we're leading our church through this time. And we need to ask it with the right voices at the table so we get balance in that answer. Which ministries are bearing fruit, and where do you have sucker shoots? Things that are just pulling energy off of the organization, but not helping you move forward. Secondly, I want you to think about exegeting your community. How would you do that? You wonder when we're all inside. Good question. So I would encourage you to ask this set of questions of your community. What are you missing? What are you looking forward to getting back to? What are you excited to do when we can get out again? And how are you spending your time these days? When we answer questions like those, we think about the greatest needs of our community. It becomes very clear very quickly what we need to do to shape the work of the church today. Lastly, I want to say that what you measure really matters. And so as you discern new ways forward, the metrics that we've always used are not going to be the metrics now. We're not going to be so geared toward attendance and possibly even giving right now, but really need to think instead about how are people going and growing? How are we developing disciples? What does it look like for people to engage in the work that we're doing? And are they engaging? Think about both inbound metrics and outbound metrics. How are people finding you, and how are you reaching out into the community? So with that, and thinking about reaching out into the community, I'm going to pass it off to Josh.
Uh-oh, Josh, you're on mute. There you go.
Right. Thank you. We've talked so far about what pruning looks like in the context of a leader, what it looks like in the context of church. I'm going to talk briefly about what it looks like in the context of mission. For our churches to be on mission, it means that we have to take into account that different kinds of plants need different kinds of pruning. There's no one-size-fits-all pruning guide, but pruning is an essential part of any life for a plant, which is to say that for your church to live faithfully into the mission of God, whether you're an established church that's been around for 20, 50, 100, or 200 years, or you're a newer church that's just creating a rhythm of life for the first time, pruning is essential for mission. Pruning is essential for new life to emerge in your church and for you to be faithful to the mission of God with your neighbors. Earlier, I shared that your church is perfectly designed to get the results it's currently getting. Let me give you another phrase, and it's going to be on the slide. Your people, your programs, your budgets, and discipleship pathways are perfectly designed to bear the fruit you're currently harvesting. Your people, programs, budgets, and discipleship pathways are perfectly designed to bear the fruit you're currently harvesting. Remissioning is about taking a really honest look about what kind of fruit your church is bearing and asking if that kind of fruit is giving life, if it's good to share with your neighbors, or is your church just sucking up all these resources and producing a sour fruit or not even bearing fruit at all. Pruning is a challenge for any time, but it's especially difficult during these disruptive times. And like the gardener in the parable from Luke's story, God gives us a chance to fertilize and to prepare the plant to do its job. The challenge for mission in the days to come is that in our desperation to just make it through this pandemic, we will mistake survival as God's hopes and dreams for our church and community. You and your leaders and your people are going to need to wrestle seriously with pruning for the sake of mission. And let me go ahead and just sort of acknowledge that there's probably 4 main reasons why you're tempted to not prune for the sake of mission. The first, and this is going to be on the screen, is that it takes too much time to discern what to cut. It's too difficult, and so it's just going to take time, and it just feels like everything's urgent right now, so I'm not going to cut anything. The second thing is that it takes too many resources to shift from a church-centric to a mission-centric way of being. And because of that challenge, we can be tempted to not prune. Maybe you feel like I'm just too late in the process. Some of us have to learn how to navigate a digital reality, communicating in whole new ways, and it just feels overwhelming. And so we just feel like we're too late, so we just throw up our hands. The last and probably the most challenging thing in remissioning a church in general is that we want to avoid conflict at all costs. Let me tell you, none of these reasons are going to suffice. Remissioning your church is hard. It requires courage. It requires healthy leadership and different voices like Q and Christy have talked about. And you're going to have to learn how to navigate conflict. So, what questions should you be asking to help prune your church for the sake of mission? There are 3 main questions. The first is, what things are overgrown that keep us from living on mission in our neighborhoods and community? You already have existing good programs, events, and discipleship pathways, but maybe they've just grown too large and they've taken on all these extra things that are convenient but not necessary. The second question is, what things are actually unproductive? In your discipleship pathways, your programs and events, what are productive things that have just really lost their way? Maybe there's something that's just based on other people's preferences, or they're devoid of presence and proximity to your neighborhood. What's unproductive that just needs to go? The last question is, what needs more attention so that the branch can be more productive? What are you really good at in shepherding inside of your church that can be redirected to be a gift to your neighbors? Start with your assets. Start with things that you're good at for the sake of your church that could be utilized and rooted in your communities and neighborhoods. The last thing I want to give you is markers of good pruning. These are the markers of good pruning that Christy and Q and I think are signs that your pruning has been effective and good. And these will be on the screen. New life emerging out of death, You see reconciling relationships, so where there's been typically people against each other or not working for a common good, you see people coming together, practicing forgiveness and going towards each other. There's a growing sense from community leaders of the common good with your church. You see a shift in your people from being consumers to creators with you. And then lastly, you have individuals, and as a church, you learn to discern the presence of God in everyday life. So we know that we shared a lot of content, but that is a big, big part of our hearts of why pruning is so important during these disruptive times.
Thanks. Wow. I know that there are tons of questions going off in the chat, lots of comments. You all have given us a lot to think about and consider. And so right now, we're going to take a couple of moments to consider some specific questions, and then we'll also field questions from our Q&A section. So also for those of you that are joining, we are going to share the replay. So stay tuned for that. And I would encourage everyone to go back through and listen and ask these questions and reflect. That way we can kind of really get the benefits of what's being shared. So the first question I'd like to offer to the panel is, what is the economic impact of pruning, and specifically during the pandemic as we seek to remission our churches?
I'll jump in. I think it's important to differentiate pruning from some sort of a cost-saving work that's happening in the church. Sometimes the things we prune will save funds, but that's not the reason we prune. And I think it's important to be in the right mindset as we think about pruning, and remember that we're pruning something that's living. So we prune in God's kingdom from a place of abundance and not from a place of scarcity. If we start pruning from a place of scarcity, we're gonna cut back a lot of things that may have the potential to bear fruit out of a mindset of fear, really. And that's just not where we're convinced that the church is called to be. So I think we all will agree that pruning is something that happens out of a place of abundance. One of the things that Josh said to us as we were thinking about this is that we don't have a lack of resources most often, but rather a lack of imagination. And I think that is true. This is about a theological imagination that we're trying to cultivate within the body to help us to steward well that which we've been called to steward.
I think there are a couple of big pieces when it comes to economic impact. One has to do with the building, I think we do need to think about, and I'm kind of coming from perspective of immigrant churches, which had to be renters oftentimes. I think we're all immigrant churches now. We need to share our resources, our possessions, especially our buildings. And I think we do need to rethink our stewardship, which can also be a euphemism for idolatry of property. So I think we need to give that up to kingdom purposes and share with other congregations and rethink this relationship of landlords and tenants. I think we need to be core laborers in the kingdom building, and so we need to be able to do that. I think the other is staff idea, and I think we need to kind of think about how perhaps having staff has sometimes hindered the rest of the body from moving into some leadership roles that they should be called into, and we haven't discovered the gifts that other people have because the staff is taking care of everything. And I think we do need to think about bivocational pastorate or co-vocational pastorates. And I think there's a lot of things that we still need to explore. What does it mean for churches to think about having enterprise and where pastors can be employed and put bread on the table, but then also that was going to enable them to keep on pastoring for less in some ways. But I think there's no cookie cutter answers, but I think we need to start being creative about all of those things. Everything's up for grabs in many ways.
I think, as one of the white males on this panel, I think it's going to be really important for churches that have experienced some privilege, had an abundance of resources, while others haven't necessarily had endowments or large reserves of funds in order to make things work. I think it's going to be really important for churches that still have resources coming out of this pandemic to think about kingdom economics, which is how do we give our life away for the sake of a bigger mission? What does it look like for us to not just share resources and space, but to actually see that our ability to be a laborer in the kingdom is wrapped up with everyone else's ability to be a laborer in the kingdom. It's sort of like the best of old denominational networks when a larger church would give a disproportionately higher amount of resources to help everyone's tide to raise up. We need to be thinking really thoughtfully about how do we give our life away and not withhold or have a scarcity mindset and make it difficult for other churches to thrive alongside of those who often had more resources from the get-go.
Wow, that's great. Thanks so much for sharing your perspectives. So as we walk us through the content, there's a lot of changes that could potentially happen as a result of pruning. How do you lead through the disappointment and the grief that your church experiences as a result of pruning?
So I'll take a crack at this one first. Ron Heifetz from the Harvard Business School says this about leadership, that it's disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. It's not a very hopeful way of talking about leadership, but it's a very true thing about leadership. Is that part of navigating people through times of change is that you can't give everything to them at once, because sometimes folks need time, they need process, they need the ability for the Spirit to do a work in their hearts to grow over time. But the reality is that the pandemic has sped up the process whether we're ready or not. The truth is the only way to really navigate this is to go right at it. A couple years ago, we pruned our worship from 2 different gatherings that were based on different worship style preferences into one service where everybody gave up a ton of their preferences for the sake of a larger mission. And I had a woman call me who's really kind. She said that she liked me, she was very nice, but she said something that was really important that I think will connect with us in this moment. She said, amidst all the changes that had happened in her life, she lost her husband, one of her children got divorced, and her child and grandchild had to move in with them. It seemed like her life was just changing too much, too fast. It was all too hard. And so she loved just coming to worship, knowing what to expect, what to predict week after week. It helped her to feel anchored. And the first thing I said to her is, I'm so sorry. And then I said, we failed you as a church, not because we made the shift to one worship service, but that for 20 years, we failed to disciple her in such a way that she could navigate the change in worship and in being church, so that she can navigate the changes and loss and grief that were going to come in her everyday life. So instead of discipling her through change and grief and loss, we actually made it more difficult for her to follow Jesus in her everyday life by not pruning or changing in our actual experiences of church together.
And I want to reiterate the personal grieving that the leader has to do so that it doesn't come off as patronizing or kind of dismissing people's legitimate sense of loss when they are going through changes, but having solidarity with them. But then I think being able to look on behalf of the people into the future with expectancy and with hope and with new life. And I think so going through that whole process personally is going to be really key for leading people.
Yeah, I agree with what Q just said very much. And I think part of the process of leading through the challenge of so much change involves really staying in step with the Spirit. And so there is so much of a very spiritual component to this. And I think, each day begins with this strong desire to stay in step with the Holy Spirit and what we are shown to do, that we then are able to step into that and do it in God's strength, not in our own strength, and in humility. And I think I've learned a lot of humility in leading through change. It's been something that I mean, I've been humbled many times, but God continues to prove so faithful. And I think being really grounded in who we're called to be and what we're called to do is very important. And I also think it's just essential to keep that really healthy dynamic of a relationship with the Lord that's very strong. That's the root of all this change.
Thanks. And so how does one as a leader navigate our own anxiety and disappointment during the pruning process as a leader?
That part is so hard. Just keeping it real. I mean, gosh, I've shed a lot of tears over disappointment, feeling disappointed by people, disappointing people. Just in the process, it's hard. And I don't want to sugarcoat that or make it seem like this is an easy thing. I think that taking up our cross is hard work. And I think that churches are called to take up their cross as well. And that is hard work. And it doesn't always feel good or pleasant. And sometimes it's just really, really tough. So again, I come back to that spiritual walk and really being grounded in who you're called to be. And there have been times where I've just had to take that pastor hat off and just be willing to kind of turn that up and say, Lord, I just need to receive. And very much to receive what he has for me on that day, so that I then can step back into that work. So.
Yeah, Diane Langberg says pastors are sheep before they're shepherds, and I think that we really actually need to live that, not just as a something that we just pass off as a cliche. I think pastors need spiritual directors. They need counselors in order to process the pain that they're going to receive as a result of all of this transition. So now more than ever, I think we need to have spiritual care for our own lives. And we need a space that where it's safe and where we can where we are able to process that with somebody else.
I would say just really like tangibly and specifically, like find a counselor, find a spiritual director. It's really important to get some of those structures in place before the crisis comes, before you have to face some of the really difficult challenges. Don't wait until you're feeling like you're already drowning to reach out. One of the best things for me has been to regularly have a counselor or a spiritual director or a coach, people outside of me that help me to see the truth about what's going on the inside of me and how I'm connecting with God. Another huge part of this is to remember to care for your body. There's a great and important book called The Body Keeps the Score. Our bodies carry some of the trauma that we have to go through this process. Q said earlier that it's important to have an identity outside of your role. But I think it's important for us to be very real and transparent with you. Like, you will have to navigate anxiety and disappointment, both in others, in yourself, because this is some of the most beautiful, hard, challenging, life-giving work. It's the path of the cross. And so our expectations are not that doing this work is always up and to the right, where it always just magically gets better. There are times when I spent, one of my 15th wedding anniversary huddled on the couch with my wife praying and just sort of like hanging on, because sometimes this is really, really brutal work. But in the middle of all that, we find Christ in new ways. We see the church come alive in new ways. It's a remarkable experience. It's fulfilling in your own call and sense of hope, but it is challenging. And I just feel like it's important for us to not sugarcoat the work in front of you.
Thanks. So we've got a bunch of great questions from the attendees. One of them is, what kind of book recommendation would you make that can help guide through self-care, soul care?
Yeah, we've got a bunch of further resources list, and that's I think going to be shared with all of the attendees. So take a look at that. But I think Curtis Zachary also is mentioned on that list, and the book is called Soul Rest. So that would be a good one to do, and I think others also have some other recommendations.
Yeah, I think emotionally healthy spirituality is a great one that you can do with your team, or emotionally healthy leader, because it both includes the rhythms, but also some of the other emotional practices that are going to be really emotional habits that are helpful for your team to develop together.
And I would add Soul Feast to the list. And there are a bunch of others that are not coming to the tip of my tongue, so maybe later I can make a list and we can share it out, but absolutely second EHS.
Great. And so can we also just explore the idea of navigating this for those that are operating in a pastor-centric context? We've had someone say, let's see, how do you lead through change through the remissioning process into polycentric leadership?
I think it's really important to begin by praying for eyes to see the people that God has placed around you, who He has uniquely equipped to walk with you in this journey, because they are there. And then you need to begin strategically elevating their voices. I come from a model that's been very pastor-centric, and I've worked hard to change that, to bring collaborative leadership, polycentric leadership. But in order to do that, you've got to look for the people who are gifted, and you've got to be willing to pass that ball. Give it to them and let them run with it. And I think that is absolutely critical to establishing a team. The people are there. It's having the eyes to see them.
And I think just starting to implement this transition from being the one that's always got to be upfront to now being the nurturer, the facilitator, the discipler. I'm here to stir up your gifts so that you can start to take this on. And so now I'm more of the coach. And so having this gradual process of that coaching process where you are gradually letting these others step up more and more, while you are the one that's kind of equipping them from the background more and more, and giving them feedback and opening up doors for them to walk into. And then even convening when we are making decisions, convening these others and inviting them to the table and inviting their voices so that we all can make decisions together rather than decisions that are handed down from on high. So kind of making that transition. So thinking about how can we have that process of transition.
One of the practical ways we navigate this in my context, if you've read Building a Discipling Culture, this is the square. It's kind of the way to think about multiplying disciples. And probably the simplest way I think about discipleship and beginning to get out of the pastor-centric is instead of the pastor kind of doing everything and just hoping that people magically pick up on how they could join in that work or discover their own calling or vocation, I just bring people along with me. So it starts with I do, you watch, then I do, you help, and then you do, I help, and then you do, I watch. And then I asked them to think about how to share that same methodology of bringing other people along with someone else. And that's how discipleships are multiplied. It's actually that simple. It takes time, but the idea of just dropping it in someone's lap may not be the best. If we can figure out how to invite people into that journey and to discover and do some of the reflective work with them, you'll find that they have all kinds of latent leadership skills that God has gifted them with through the Spirit. And they are just kind of waiting to be given the opportunity to lead.
Thanks. And as part of making this pivot, one of the questions is, if churches are struggling now financially, the diffusion of leadership duties threatens that status potentially. So how do we reconcile, any potential salary impact for the leader that's beginning to share different areas of their leadership?
So, go ahead, Christy.
I was just going to say, I think there's always more work to be done. So I wouldn't worry about running out of work right now as a pastor. That's my honest and first answer. But at the same time, I think this is a time to look hard at any staff we do have and ask, what are all the skills you bring to bear? And then to realign accordingly. This is a work that we've been doing in my church, and I'm the only full-time person. Everyone else is really part-time. But I've basically said, can I see your resume again? Because all of a sudden we need all new skills. So let me know everything you know how to do. And it's almost like working a puzzle to figure out who's gonna end up where.
It also means for you who have been in maybe the central role or the senior pastor seat to also learn how to share power, because we believe that God is abundant. And so in previous churches, I've done work, and some of the branding work I'd done before was around making and editing videos. And here I am, like, dusting off old skills that I haven't used on a regular basis in like 7 years. But it's been wonderful because it allows me to actually think about discipleship in a new context. To the degree that the pastor is making decision rooted in fear, that's going to impact the way that the rest of the team and others are making decisions about fear. Like, at the end of the day, is it a lack of resources? Like, do we believe that God hasn't provided enough resources for us to do our work? Not just finances, because finances aren't the central piece of what God's interested in. Fruitfulness is very different than financial survival. And those are hard questions, but important questions to wrestle with.
And I think the way that for a long time, the way that pastors have justified their roles in a church has been, they're the public presence, right? When they see people, when people see them doing different things and they're very, very busy or seem to be busy, then that's how you justify this. But I think there's going to be plenty of work to be done behind the scenes in terms of working with people, coaching people, discipling people, and helping them to find their gifts, and strategizing on how we can move forward with these missional directions, and all of those things are going to really take up a lot of a pastor's work. So I think even though there might be less and less of a visible public presence, I think there's still a lot of work to be done that's going to actually lead to flourishing of the church in the long run.
Each time I've handed off a piece, I've seen things grow, not diminish. And I think that's part of the kingdom way of being, right? Is that the more we hand off, the more we're then able to do, and the more is able to be done. So I would encourage leaders to just keep that mindset. That's an important mindset.
Yes, and as part of the feedback that's been given today was the idea of releasing the ape. So as we think about leaning into APEST and pruning, which comes first, pruning or adding the missing elements of APEST to your leadership team?
I think you've got to start by finding those voices that are missing at the table, because that's when the best pruning work happens. I think that those voices are already present in your community, and it's a matter of looking for those voices and helping them to rise. And as those voices come forward, then we have a more holistic picture of what the church is called to be. I think it's dangerous to prune without a good understanding of who's at the table. And if you're missing a voice, it's okay to name that voice. For instance, on my team, one of our lower scores is in the area of profit. And so we will talk about things, and then I'll say, and what would the prophet say? And that's a way of holding space for the voice that's not on my staff team right now. So maybe that helps as well.
Wow, Christy, well said. Something might get chopped that needs to remain, or vice versa, without the voice. Anything else that Q and Josh would add? Okay, well, I've got another question. I've got tons of questions for you. So what about, can you explain very briefly in the time that we have left, something that's being pruned now, right now in this season that you think is going well?
So for us, one of the things that shifted is that for a while, when you're remissioning a church, you throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall to see what's going to stick, because your church is trying to discern its voice and its way of kind of occupying a particular space in the community to be a blessing and to grow, to lead, to serve. And so for a while, we've tried a bunch of different things in order to live a faithful presence in our community. And what we've experienced through the pandemic is that our community has helped us to more clearly identify what our voice is and to actually prune for the sake of mission. So what's happened is that our community leaders have helped identify that our church is actually really good at helping with food insecurity in our community. And so because of that, they've helped us to whittle away and say, what are our things to say yes to? What are the things we need to pass on to other churches? And what are things that we just need to flat out say, this isn't in our ability to process right now? And maybe even some pruning of already existing mission experiences that we've had so that we could be more faithful in this moment to our community and their requests for help. I mean, it's as simple as, if I came to you hungry, will you feed me? And so for us, when the police chief and social services and a local nonprofit all come and say, will you help us figure out how to feed our community right now because all the other food pantries are shutting down, what can we do? Like, that helped us to discern together with those leaders and to prune some of the things that we were spending our time on.
Well, I would just want to thank everybody for being with us today as we've been talking about pruning for where we are, remissioning the church in disruptive times.